This is Inside Geneva, a podcast from Swissinfo, the multilingual public media company of Switzerland. I'm Imogen Foulkes. It's 75 years since the world united around a groundbreaking agreement, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. On Inside Geneva, in a series of exclusive interviews, we talk to the men and women who have led the United Nations human rights work over the years. What were the challenges of what some call the UN's most impossible job? What were their successes and what were their failures? Let's hear from them.
Yes, it is an impossible mission to try to guarantee all human rights, social, economic, political, cultural, of the whole people of the world.
I remember feeling to myself, I'm going to get on top of this somehow. This job is impossible. Everything is very, very difficult. It's extremely hard work, but I'm somehow going to get on top of it. And it got better.
To be the megaphone for the denunciation of injustices at some point becomes counterproductive because it just illuminates how impotent the system is.
The United States has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or CEDAW, Convention Against Discrimination of Women. And they told me that's because they're a democracy, they have their own institutions.
Someone asked me, possibly even you, asked me about Donald Trump. And I said, yes, I think he's dangerous. And that became the headline out of the press conference.
There was lots of pressure, lots of criticism, but you know what? At the end, with everybody, there was this saying in the office, when everybody criticizes, you're not going back.
What has to happen in this world so that we come to this never again attitude?
The job of Human Rights Commissioner has sometimes been called the UN's hardest. After all, these men and women don't get to hand out food parcels or medicines or set up shelters for refugees. Instead, they have to tell governments when they're treating their citizens badly. So why take the job? The very first in the post was Jose Ayala Lasso, a diplomat from Ecuador.
Indeed, I was always, during my diplomatic career, I was interested in human rights, in social questions. And I dedicated my life in diplomacy to work for establishing a new international order with recognition of the obligations of the states regarding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know, there was a sort of different interpretations about the validity of the declaration. Some people say that it was a declaration. It is a non-compulsory and obligatory law for the states. And others consider that the principles established in the declaration were so important that they were applied and should be applied as a law which does not need the acceptance of the states, but they have the force to impose. And so I tried to support this second position.
Let me come to your time in office. While you were UN Human Rights Commissioner, there was Rwanda. This must have been very difficult.
Indeed. I took office on the beginning of March, if I remember well. And less than a week after taking office in Geneva, I was observing what was happening in Rwanda. And it was absolutely necessary to do something. So I decided to go to Rwanda to see what can I do, what could I do in those circumstances. My office was not yet really established. I had not a dollar. There was a theoretical budget, which was less than $500,000 for the whole year. And I went with two advisors. And what I saw in Rwanda was terrible. I was obliged to work together with the general, the Canadian chief of the armed forces, in lands where you found hundreds and thousands of killed people in the most outrageous manner. So it was terrible. The impression I received was an impression of drama, of criminality, of need not to believe on human nature and goodness of human nature. But that was my sentimental reaction. I was also an administrative officer of the United Nations, and I was obliged to do something to resolve the problem. The only actions I considered useful in those moments were to talk with the government, which was presided by the Hutus, and to talk with the chief of the rebellion, General Kagame, a Tutsi.
You said you reacted in you described it as a sentimental way, a human way, many would say, but you also had to do something. But still confronted by what you saw in Rwanda, did you ever wonder, what's the point? Can I achieve anything?
Yeah. When I was appointed, many officers of the United Nations, ambassadors, and of the American government offered a dinner to me. And one of the senators of the United States made a speech. And he said to me in the speech, "You have accepted an impossible mission." And I said, yes, it is an impossible mission to try to guarantee the effectiveness of all human rights, social, economic, and political, cultural, even the right to development of the whole people of the world. I said, that is an impossible, but something should begin.
Jose Ayala Lasso was that beginner. Next, in the human rights hot seat, Mary Robinson from Ireland.
Well, I grew up in the west of Ireland. My parents were both medical doctors, though my mother didn't practice as a GP after 5 of us arrived in 6 years in a good Catholic tradition. I was wedged between those brothers, and that gave me a very early interest in human rights and gender equality and using my elbows and everything it took. Because my parents would say to me over and over again, you have the same opportunities. We will give you the same chances. We regard you as totally equal to your 4 brothers. But Irish society wasn't doing that.
Mary Robinson trained and practiced as a lawyer. Then she became president of Ireland. And then, to her surprise, she was asked to become UN Human Rights Commissioner.
All my knowledgeable friends said, Mary, I wouldn't take that job. Anyway, when I arrived in Geneva, I found that our office was in the back of the Palais des Nations, a very low position. And I went on a very difficult trip back to Rwanda, where I had had 3 welcomed visits as president of Ireland. But when I arrived wearing my UN hat, they utterly disregarded and in effect kind of humiliated me. I had difficulty meeting Kagame, whom I had met at all the other visits.
Why do you think that was?
Because of the UN record. You know, they were very anti-UN. When I went back to Ireland after that visit to Uganda first, and then Rwanda, and then South Africa, I was exhausted. I was taking sleeping pills, and my mental health was being affected. And I had a brother, a doctor, my oldest brother, had gone to New Zealand and was back on his first visit and said, Mary, you're on the verge of a mental breakdown. And when I heard my brother saying that, I thought, no, I'm not, no way. And I threw away the sleeping pills and I kind of took another fortnight to rest. And I came back and I remember feeling to myself, I'm going to get on top of this somehow. This job is impossible. Everything is very, very difficult. It's extremely hard work, but I'm somehow going to get on top of it. And it got better.
But only the second person to hold the job, Robinson struggled to put human rights at the centre of the United Nations agenda.
Kofi Annan had introduced his reform. He took up the post in January 1997, some months earlier. And in July, he had his reform package, which he had highlighted the importance of 4 areas: peace and security, development, economic and humanitarian. And he said, human rights has to be part of all of those. So the High Commissioner for Human Rights uniquely would be a member of all four. Well, I can tell you, when I was there, human rights was spoken about. When I was not there, nobody else was speaking about human rights, and nobody else was there to speak about human rights. So I gave a Romanes lecture in, I think, October 1997 in Oxford. And I said that the United Nations had lost the plot on human rights. And I gave chapter and verse of some of the problems, because I felt this had to be. And the following morning, I got a call from my boss saying, Mary, you can't criticize the UN. You're in the UN now. And I said, well, when you appointed me, or Secretary General, you said I should remain an outsider mentally for as long as possible. And he said, no, you can't criticize the UN when you're in it. And I said, well, I'm going to do my job as best I can, and left it at that.
Do you think that was maybe, do you see that looking back as perhaps one of your biggest achievements, is helping the UN refine the plot on human rights?
I think possibly helping to do that, because over and over again, I kept saying to myself, I represent the first 3 words of the Charter of the United Nations, we the peoples. That's what I represent, not the states. I realized I had no power as such. I had no big stick. I had no executive way of trying to get people to do what I dearly wanted them to do. So the only way that I could bring attention to human rights problems was going there. And I found myself hugely, my batteries would get charged by the belief in human rights of those who knew, because they were deprived of their rights, how important they were, whether they were voting rights, whether they were economic and social rights, whether they were rights to a fair, uncorrupt political system, whatever.
With the start of the new millennium, it was Louise Arbour of Canada's turn to take the human rights job.
I was educated in an extremely homogeneous environment, in a kind of girls' Catholic convent school that became a classical college. And so essentially I was educated by women. I was raised by my mother, just with my brother. My father left when I was quite young. And then I was educated by nuns with a bunch of girls until I was 20 years old and went to law school. So maybe my interest in pluralism and may come in reaction to having been so cloistered, is that the word, or sort of restricted in my horizons when I was growing up.
Arbour had already combined her legal training with human rights. She served on the International Tribunal for former Yugoslavia and famously indicted former Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic on charges of war crimes.
I would have never thought that in my lifetime criminal law would take this international positioning. After the Nuremberg trials in Tokyo, despite all kinds of multilateral efforts, it looked like this was not going to happen. And then, frankly, quite miraculously, when you think of it, the Security Council of the United Nations, of all places, of all political places, added law, criminal law, to its otherwise pretty empty toolbox of conflict management. Now, this had nothing to do with me, but it was revolutionary. I don't think the Security Council has done anything that imaginative since. And that's why the indictment of Milosevic was important. If I did not firmly believe that one day he would stand trial in The Hague, I wouldn't waste my time doing this really hard job. I'd move on and do something that is more anchored in reality. It was anchored in reality, even though at the time I signed the indictment, I could not have written the script on how this would all unfold, but I was really persuaded. The long arm of the law is very patient. And I still feel the same way today.
Like Mary Robinson, Louise Arbour wasn't really sure she wanted the human rights job. Unlike lawyers or judges, the UN Human Rights Chief can't prosecute or sentence.
When you arrive in the role of High Commissioner for Human Rights, I think that's part of the dilemma. How do you use your voice because I think to be the megaphone for the denunciation of injustices at some point becomes counterproductive, because it just illuminates how impotent the system is. It's like you scream in the wilderness and it yields absolutely no remedial action.
Interestingly, just earlier today, I was talking to somebody about the fact that we're going to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Do you think this century there has been, maybe dating from 9/11, an erosion? Do we care about them less? Do we respect them less?
Yes. I don't think we're in a particularly good place, which doesn't mean that the project is over and we should just abandon an ideal that I still believe is more than worth pursuing. I think the human rights framework as a kind of organizing principle for humanity is unbeatable. I think it's more than a worthwhile project. And I see a couple of fault lines in the project. The dominance of the Western embrace of the agenda has had, I think, two consequences. The first one is, as the West was promoting its so-called values, others started to notice that, happily for the West, its values always coincided with its interests, which I think generated a lot of skepticism about the bona fides of the entire enterprise. I think that's the first consequence. And the second one is the West, and I say the West, I mean, we understand each other. I mean, Europe, America, we're always in a position of asking others to do something that was hard for them to do. But when it came a time where the West was asked to do something that was hard for it to do, it choked. And the examples of, I think, the post 9/11 world showed how the US was very quick to even reconsider fundamental norms like the absolute prohibition on torture. All of a sudden, well, it was just so inconvenient that it could be overlooked. And now if we look at the entire migration agenda, it's even more apparent how, for once, when Europe and America are asked, and that includes Canada, are asked to do something that's hard for them to do this time, they're nowhere to be seen.
Was it time then for a human rights chief from the global south? Navi Pillay from South Africa was next.
So we grew up under apartheid and we realized there's something very unfair here. Our teachers were afraid to talk about, they would teach us democracy in Greece, but not, why don't we have democracy in South Africa? Because if they did touch on any subject that the regime thought was political, the teachers would lose their jobs. And I know one who was summarily fired, and all she did was cut out press cuttings of topical news and put it up on a chart in her classroom. This was in high school. So therefore, the fear about something not right out there and the urge to do something about it. So we were, I think, quite an alert lot there in high school.
Like Louise Arbour, Pillay had trained as a lawyer, and she'd also served on an international tribunal, this one for the Rwandan genocide. And she too, when first offered the UN's human rights job, turned it down.
I said no, because I had already packed my winter coats away. I was coming back home to sunny South Africa, where I would have had the opportunity to serve on the Constitutional Court. That was my plan. And when Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General, interviewed me, he said, no, we need you now. The states need you. We can't not have a High Commissioner. You have to respond to a call that's made to you, a trust that people place in you. Really, I mean, these look like highly laudable goals. So if you ask me, so what moved me from where I wanted to go to this was the Secretary General saying, we need you now.
Looking back, what were your biggest challenges? Or do you have standout successes? I mean, this is a hard job in the sense that you have to tell governments they're behaving badly.
I'll tell you what they said to me, ambassadors and, politicians, heads of state and so on. They respected that I was a judge, and as a judge, that I listen. So even Israel complimented me in bringing a balance, meaning I included their point of view in my reports. That's what you have to do. You stick to the UN principles. I would constantly remind them, you passed this international convention, and you've undertaken obligations, so you have to carry that out.
Did you feel that big, powerful countries, we could say China, Russia, the United States, do they escape scrutiny because of their power?
They do. They do. The United States has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or CEDAW, Convention Against Discrimination of Women. And they told me that's because they're a democracy, they have their own institutions. But they do escape international scrutiny that they push for in respect of other states. Yes, there is some double standards there. People need to be reminded that they have a role to play. So if a good law is passed there nationally or internationally, it's not going to be implemented. It's not governments who woke up one day and decided, oh, we got to do more for human rights. No, it's really skewed. It's bad in the lack of accountability by politicians as soon as they get into power. I often wonder, for instance, why do they need so much security for themselves against us, the people? It should be the other way around. You don't need to surround yourself with security as if we, the people, are going to attack them. I think then after 75 years of this, there has to be a revolutionary change where people should realize their own power and worth and reassert and demand that they be included in all discussions, and the collective opposition to apartheid. I see all these as victories of having this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a common standard that every state actually has agreed. No state has distanced itself from that treaty. So I see hope in that, and I feel these are the tools that civil society has.
So we're beginning to see a bit of a pattern here. Dedicated people who take the job even though they know it hasn't got much power, apart from the power to speak out. Our next human rights chief was determined to speak out, though he admits that growing up, human rights wasn't really his focus.
I was far too immature and delinquent to be thinking lofty ideas and profound thoughts. It really was my first proper working experience after I did my military service in Jordan, which took me to UN peacekeeping and 2 years of service in the Balkans from early 1994 to early 1996, that first exposed me to the enormity of atrocity crimes, the overwhelming emotional response one feels, the revulsion one experiences, the senselessness of it all. There's nothing that can justify killing or destruction like that, nothing at all.
So when he arrived in Geneva, Zeid was determined to make human rights loud and clear.
I knew from my experience in the former Yugoslavia that if the UN Secretariat believed, and I think mistakenly, that it's in the friends business, it produces catastrophic results. The UN is not there to become friendly with the member states. We were in the respect business, not in the friends business. And for me, it mattered little whether they hated me or they disliked me or so forth. I think the point was, were they wary of me enough to take me seriously and to respond in kind? And I think that's what matters. And if you're concerned about maintaining easy relationships or being comfortable, then that's not the job for you. I'm sorry, that's my view of it. I sort of felt I knew I could push, and governments could take it. And in many respects, ambassadors would come after the telling off that I would give them would come up to me privately and say, you know, my government deserved it, and thank you for saying it, and I'm going to oppose you publicly, but it was the right thing to say.
You very famously made a speech about xenophobes, populists, and racists, and you were talking about political leaders, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Nigel Farage, UK, and notably Donald Trump in the United States.
Yeah, it was halfway through my my term as High Commissioner, and I think from the initial 2 years, I thought, well, whoever the High Commissioner is, you're going to have and face ad hominem attacks, even if you were only to speak critically of the conduct of states when they were violating the rights of their own people and very much against the obligations that they themselves took on. And I think I got to halfway and I thought, well, it's not pointed enough. And it's not just governments, because governments are not monolithic structures. It's individuals who head these governments who pour this poison into their societies. And it's a well-known poison. It's not a new poison, what they're doing. And so I felt when I had the occasion to speak in The Hague, I felt it was the right time to, and I think I was, yes, the first, if not the only UN official to go after these leaders or so-called leaders, because they may be leaders in official sense, but there's nothing about them that I think, you know, there's very little about them that I'd want to see in my own children. I mean, you know, the opposite of someone like Nelson Mandela, who's a real leader, you know, someone who you deeply respect.
In response to Donald Trump on the campaign trail saying that he would torture, you suggested that his election could be dangerous. Do you think that prediction was proven right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I remember the occasion. You may even have been there. It was a press conference. And I think I spoke for about an hour and a half about everything else. And then someone asked me, possibly even you, asked me about Donald Trump. And I said, yes, I think he's dangerous. And that became the headline out of the press conference. I mean, how could you not think that? I mean, how could anyone not think that? Any thinking person, that is.
Everyone brings their own personal style to this difficult job, but our next human rights chief brought what no one else had so far brought: personal experience of repression and human rights violations. Michelle Bachelet grew up under Chile's violent military dictatorship. She always stood up for human rights.
Yes, even though maybe at that period of time, I might not call it human rights, because probably I was not so aware about the concepts and the Universal Declaration and so on. But since I was a child, I was always trying to, if I would say, ensure that people will receive the dignity, the respect that they deserve.
But those views in 1970s Chile could be dangerous. Bachelet's father, who supported a constitutional democracy, was arrested.
They took him and tortured him, and so he had a heart attack and he died because of the heart attack in the jail. And then I mean, of course, we were against the dictatorship, so we did political work, like underground, of course. So once, but there was a friend of my mom who my mom was supporting, because my mother was not a militant of any party, and she, under torture, gave the name of my mother as a supporter, if I must say. And then they went home and they took us, me and my mom, to Villa Grimaldi. That's a torture center. Afraid, I mean, what you didn't know at that time when you were in those places, that you were disappeared. Your family didn't know where you were. It was not a formal jail. No, there were jails in very bad conditions. The thing is not to know what is going to happen, how long that is going to last. What will be, I mean, of course, they separated me from my mom as well. So I didn't know how she was. Yeah, but on the other hand, you felt that all those things were so awful, what was going on in the country. that you needed to be as strong as possible, and not to fail, and not to, how could I say, confess things that could harm other people.
When democracy returned to Chile, Bachelet became a successful politician, serving twice as her country's president. Then, just as she was planning to spend more time with her family, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres asked her to become a human rights commissioner.
But at the beginning, I was saying to him, look, my mom is old. The truth is I've been living my family for a long time in a second place, and I think it's the time. But the situation was very difficult in the world. It was not as now, that is even worse, but it was very difficult. So he told me, please, Michelle, please apply, because really I need you. And I talked to my mom. She was at that time like 90 years old. And she said to me, go ahead, because this is very important, and so on.
Bachelet began to research what the job required.
I started reading, and one of the articles that really impacted me was The Impossible Job. Because it says, because the High Commissioner has to be the voice of the voiceless. So you have to denounce situations that needs to be known, and but on the other hand, and try to ensure that governments do the right thing. But on the other hand, you need to support governments. So you need to build trust with them. It's a very complex, because if you are hitting somebody and telling you are a bad guy or bad government because you are violating the rights of your people, but on the other hand, ask them, I want to support you. How can I support you? I mean, it's a very complex situation.
Most complex of all, the UN's approach to China amid widespread evidence of Beijing's oppression of the Uyghur Muslim community. Bachelet had commissioned a report on the subject, but waited and waited to publish it.
Pressures came from everywhere. Every time I had meetings with the European Union, the question will come, and every time when will come, etc. So probably because I understand what politics is and what geopolitics is, I knew there was part of the job. I knew this will happen anyway. And I used to tell them, look, if you ask me not to publish this, then tomorrow another big country will call me and said, not publish this. And then another big country will come. And so then the only thing I can do is to fall back home, because I have to do my job. I have to, if I commit to something, I would do it. It might take me long because I needed to be serious, professional, to give the opportunity to everyone to give their arguments and their experiences. Not everyone, I mean, not every man or women of the world, but I mean, everybody who felt that needed to, put their point of view on this. And then we needed to make something that we feel it is serious. So there was lots of pressure, lots of criticism, but you know what? At the end, with everybody, there was this saying in the office, when everybody criticizes, you're not going back. It's only one part criticizes, you're doing bad, you're doing something wrong. But if everybody means that, okay, you're trying to do your things as well. It was not easy, but I think you need to do what you need to do.
The report finally came out on Michelle Bachelet's last day in office, and it was hard-hitting. It suggested that Beijing's treatment of its Uyghur community could amount to a crime against humanity. But the long delay overshadowed Bachelet's other work, challenging institutional racism. And it highlighted once again how difficult it is for UN human rights to do its work when the violators are also superpowers. And now, Austrian Volker Türk has been in the job for just a year. He's determined to get back to basics. He's even got a fraying copy of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in his office. It was given to him more than 40 years ago when he was in high school.
In light of the history of my own country, Holocaust, its own atrocities that was committed by Austrians during the Second World War, it was very formative for me to actually really say, okay, what has to happen in this world so that we come to this never again attitude. So this never again, the history of my country, the fact that we were on the edge of the Iron Curtain, were very, very important parts of my upbringing. The nuclear threat as well. I remember as a child, I was always very worried. I was always happy when the clouds were up there because I thought that there wouldn't be anything. So it was very strange, because you were in this environment of threats as well, different threats than today. But nonetheless, as a child, I could remember the fear about this. And I always wanted to fight for peace. I was very early on interested in other cultures, in other parts of the world, and in human rights.
But Türk is confronted with huge challenges. There are an astonishing 55 conflicts raging around the world right now, and many fear those rules and values that we committed to 75 years ago are crumbling.
We cannot afford to see that. We cannot afford that human rights becomes the collateral damage of geopolitics or of any of the crises that we see. I mean, we have 55 conflicts at the moment. One of the highest numbers since the end of the Second World War. About a quarter of humanity lives in violent, fragile conflict areas, which is horrifying. We have the traffic. I mean, I want to make the comparison with traffic because we actually have traffic regulations and they exist because otherwise people would get killed. That's the same on the human rights front, and that's why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is so important. Yes, there are people who are violating traffic regulations, as there are people who violate human rights law, sometimes egregiously, as we see now. It doesn't mean that this takes away the fundamental centrality of the norms, because if we didn't have the norms, we wouldn't even know what to measure it against, and we wouldn't be able to hold people to account as well. So I think it's important to remember that, and I would see them more as temporary setbacks, terrible setbacks, but we cannot afford to lose the wisdom that comes from human rights norms.
What and how then should we celebrate the 75th anniversary?
We actually commemorate the 75th anniversary, and it's really important that societies, member states at different levels, everyone who is part of the ecosystem reflects on the achievements, the successes, but also the failures, and learns from them. And we need to look also into the future. We cannot afford just to stay in the present. We need to learn from our crisis today to make it better in the future. And I hope that if there's one single message that comes across, that the centrality of human rights has to be much more pronounced than ever before.
And who could disagree? Certainly not all our former human rights chiefs.
We should not lose our faith in the capacity of human beings to act correctly.
You have the law, now push for implementation. Ask your governments the difficult questions.
The Universal Declaration is still valid because it gives sort of the minimal, if I would say, civilitarian standards, how we can live together.
What we're aiming at is to create a better human being. And that's what we're trying to do with the human rights agenda, is just to better improve ourselves and our conduct. And who can argue with that?
Human rights is the answer. Everyone has these core of human rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. But this is who we are.
If you came from another planet and just looked at the human rights framework, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all the treaties, the conventions, the work of the treaty bodies, you'd think you've arrived in heaven. So why is it not the case?
Our exclusive interviews with all the former and current UN Human Rights Commissioners are online now. You can listen to them wherever you get your podcasts, and you can subscribe to us. A reminder, you've been listening to Inside Geneva, a podcast from Swissinfo, the multilingual public media company of Switzerland. I'm Imogen Foulkes. Thanks for listening and for watching.